guys ready?
Or have you had one of those voice modding colds?
I think so.
We are ready when you are.
All right.
I'm Jamie Smith. I teach philosophy at Calvin College, where I also hold the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview, which wins for the longest endowed chair title in the world. And I also edit Comment Magazine, which is a magazine devoted to public theology for the common good.
Wonderful. And you've written a book?
I have indeed, yes.
One or two?
Yeah.
What's the latest one?
The latest that I'm really excited about is called How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor.
So I've managed to read this book cover to cover. I love it. And I really appreciate your attempt, and Taylor's attempt, to put some sort of expression behind this sort of general malaise of modernity and secular existence. And in particular, I enjoy the use of popular art and popular media as you're working through these things, because that's what we're all immersed in. That's the water we swim in. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what secular means for you and for Taylor, and how you could see it in the world around us.
Yeah, I think the big contribution, and one of the reasons why I wanted to try to help translate Taylor's big book into a more accessible argument, is that he sort of redefines the secular. If we traditionally or sort of have a habit of associating the secular with unbelief or non-belief or a-religiosity, Taylor thinks we're going to run into problems. That's not really going to help us make sense of our contemporary context. Because in fact, what's going on is not necessarily a decline in belief, but more in a sense, an explosion of all kinds of different ways that people believe. That it's not the case that people are so disenchanted with the world or inhabit such a disenchanted world that they're all kind of new atheists. To the contrary, what happens is, in a secular age, what's believable has changed, right? The plausibility structures of society have changed. So no one's belief system can be taken as axiomatic anymore, right? To live in a secular age for Taylor is to live in an age in which we realize that all beliefs are contested. But that doesn't mean that people stop believing. And in fact, they believe in all kinds of different ways. And so one of the things I try to do is absorb that argument analysis, but then look for expressions of that in contemporary culture. Taylor is an older philosopher, and when he tends to make pop culture references, he cites like Peggy Lee. Is that all there is? Which I take it was a really big hit in the 50s, but is not exactly landing. Whereas I think you can feel what he's getting at in the music of Death Cab for Cutie or in the novels of David Foster Wallace. And so I look for sort of kind of confirmation of his account in those more contemporary expressions.
You're describing the Novo Effect. Is that,
yes.
That's Taylor's term?
Exactly. So Taylor thinks that what happens is to inhabit a secular age is to live in this space in which all beliefs are contested and contestable. And that creates a kind of pressure cooker of what he calls cross pressures, where we feel all kinds of pushes and pulls on what we should think and what we should believe, and we, on the one hand, we still have a longing to believe in something ultimate, but on the other hand, the forces of doubt are also pushing on us. So everyone, even believers now, inhabit this cross-pressured space, and it's like from that pressure you get this Nova Effect, as you put it. There's this kind of explosion of different ways of believing, and I think that does a better job of making sense of contemporary experience, even in very secularized contexts, than the kind of story that New Atheism, for example, tells about just sort of increasing rationality and decreasing religiosity.
Yeah, I would almost view those kinds of what Taylor calls secular too, or what I guess you call secular too.
Yes, right.
Understandings of the world as instances of the Novo Effect, things that people are grabbing onto, perhaps.
And in some ways, those sort of secularist accounts will be loudest precisely when they feel like maybe they're not winning the day. And so I think it's not a surprise to see really aggressive forms of secularism, and yet those aren't really winning cultural champions. They get some press because they generate controversy, but I don't think, if you just sort of move around Seattle or Brooklyn or someplace like that, I don't think that actually makes sense of the kind of experience that people have in those spaces.
So we're describing the secular. We're talking about what is the secular.
Yeah.
But the book is called How Not to Be Secular.
Yeah.
So tell us about...
well, it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
How not to be secular. So also how to be secular, but also how not to be secular. So playing on that a little bit.
Yeah. Is that referring to like the sort of phenomenon, like the sort of experience?
So yeah, what I'm trying to... that's a great question. On the one hand, it is offering a descriptive account of our now. Right? What does it mean to live in this present age, this secular age? On the other hand, it is a bit of a sort of prescriptive project, and I think that's part of Taylor's account as well, which is, okay, well, what would it look like to understand that this is our present and inhabit that in a way that takes it seriously? And, I mean, I think Taylor hints at this, and I try to unpack it more fully. What does it look like to believe in a secular age? And that can't be trying to turn back the clock nostalgically to some age in which everybody agreed with me and all my neighbors were Christians, and that's not happening. And I think it's misbegotten to try to attempt that. Instead, what it looks like to live in a secular age, how to believe in a secular age, is actually owning up to this contestability of belief. Owning up, I think, in some ways, to the remarkable cross-pressure that doubt puts upon us as believers. You know, you live next to a neighbor who's just a great person, really, probably a better person than you are, and doesn't share your belief. And so that has to give you pause. And I think it's important that Christians own up to that as well and say, well, I need to take that pause seriously. I think that might be especially true for rising generations. If we're not honest about that, I think people are going to feel like we're sticking our heads in the sand and trying to hide from the secular.
So speaking of younger generations, it's easy, it's almost impossible to miss the kind of turn to tradition that's gone on recently. How do you kind of evaluate that?
Yeah. And by turn to tradition, you mean maybe sort of formerly kind of low church evangelicals discovering Anglicanism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. Yeah. So, and there still needs to be a lot more sociological work to be done to give us a robust account of that, so that we're not left with impressions. But if we run with the impressions right now, I actually think Taylor gives you resources to understand this, because he says one of the things that happens in modernity, and it's kind of Protestantism's fault, and I own this as a Protestant, right? This is a sort of Frankensteinish affective Protestantism, is a dynamic of what he calls excarnation. That is, Christian belief, religious belief, is increasingly treated as a primarily intellectual, propositional set of beliefs. And the embodied, visceral, tactile, communal, and ritual aspects of worship kind of drop out. So church becomes a lecture hall, spirituality is primarily about what you believe, and you get this excarnated form of Christianity. What's intriguing is how disenchanted that form of Christianity is. And I think what's happening in the sort of phenomenon that you're describing is people are starting to feel the paucity and flatness, the disenchantment of the forms of Christianity that they've received. And actually the postmodern moment has become an occasion to sort of open themselves to pre-modern wisdom traditions and discover there a kind of holistic gospel and a holistic Christianity that has been sorely lacking in their experience. And I applaud that. I mean, I think that's a exactly the right move for what faithful presence looks like in a postmodern context.
Do you think it's possible to be a Protestant without being a nominalist? I mean,
yes, I hope so.
Like
Although that's such a complicated question. I mean, if nominalism is part of what we are going to blame for this kind of disenchantment of the world, I think so. I think someone like Hans Boersma, actually, whose Heavenly Participation is just a fantastic statement of that, of trying to recover that sense. I don't think I have to give up my protest as a Protestant to retrieve those aspects of the Christian tradition, and I think there are still good reasons for my protest as a Protestant. But I'm wanting to embody a version of the Reformed tradition that is probably more Catholic in retrieving those pieces.
I think I'd love to keep asking like 10 more questions down that road. But
Yeah,
I think
sure.
We'll go back towards the book a little bit.
Great.
So the trouble, just to focus in on a specific concept that Taylor uses, the trouble with the reliance on sort of a sense or vibe when it comes to deity is that it's almost a challenge. It's sort of like, well, show me a man that isn't haunted with God, and I'll show you a true atheist.
Right.
And I guess...
So you mean in the sense that Taylor's account kind of wants to put on the table and say, well, the reason why the secular is still haunted is because there's a ghost there, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and he's not the only one who works with this argument. I mean, Calvin thought about this.
Sure.
N.T. Wright has a little book about this with like echoes of different things going on. But the trouble is, what if there are people who don't hear those echoes? Does Taylor have something to say to those people besides "you're lying"?
Interestingly, his move, I don't think he has much to say. He wouldn't say they're lying, right? What he would say is, look, I'm going to tell an alternative story that can be a paradigm for understanding your experience. If your experience doesn't have these pings of transcendence in them. At one point he uses this great metaphor. He says, sometimes we live in this culture and we end up it's like picking up an FM signal for a city radio station when we're way out in the country and we thought we were so far away we could never pick it up. Taylor's account is something that will be illuminating for those who've had experiences like that and maybe haven't felt the permission to be honest about them before. What he won't do is try to manufacture in you a conviction that you've had them. Do you know what I mean? In that sense, his apologetic is not as he's not trying to win an argument or prove a point as much as he is trying to offer an account that he thinks will illumine your experience. Now, I think that Taylor believes that many of us have those experiences and are looking for ways to make sense of them. This new Barbara Eichenreich book that's just come out, that's previewed in the New York Times recently, on her mystical experiences as a rationalist, is just, I think, a great expression of the kind of phenomenon that Taylor just thinks a new atheist account doesn't take seriously. He wants to take seriously without arguing that everybody is a kind of closeted Christian or something like that.
That's helpful. I was also fascinated by the idea that modernity rests not on necessary conclusions or just like lopping off unnecessary bits of our world constructs, but on contingent events.
Yeah.
And so it seems that neither you nor Taylor are in favor of just going back to a pre-modern way of looking at things. So I was wondering, how do you square the contingencies that led to modernity with the sort of irrevocability of it?
Yeah, this is part of what fascinates me about Taylor, is that he's a philosopher doing cultural analysis, but he takes history so seriously. Now, I would say, not that many folks will care about this, but this is because he's a Hegelian, right? So he wrote a big book on Hegel. Hegel's a really important influence. And what he's drawing out of that tradition is actually just a deep conviction that what happens in history is contingent. It could have gone different ways. But that once it has happened, we can't pretend like we live in some neutral space, right? In other words, we are the products of our history, and our cultures and our contexts are the products of a history. And I sometimes feel like a lot of Christian cultural analysis and apologetics is effectively ahistorical, right? It looks around and says, okay, well, we want to talk to these people, but it really thinks that all of a sudden you could just sort of undo historical implications. That Taylor, and I agree with him on this, that's not possible, and probably not desirable. In other words, this is maybe a good opportunity to say, even someone like me who sort of identifies with postmodernism and stuff, it's not anti-modernity, right? It's not a resentment project where we wish modernity didn't happen. It's trying to think about, okay, well, where are we now in light of that? So, it shouldn't be nostalgic, even though it can also look back at the contingency of that history and find pre-modern resources to say, well, what would it look like to be faithful in a contemporary age? Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I've met the question properly.
Yeah, you did. It's sort of, the first response to anybody who says modernity didn't necessarily happen is, well, if it didn't have to happen, why couldn't it just unhappen?
Yeah. Okay. That's great. And so that's the Hegelian conviction is right. It didn't have to happen, but it did happen, and it ain't going to be unhappening. Right? It's live with it. And of course, this story is particularly complicated for Taylor because in many ways, some of the forces of modernity are unleashed by the Protestant Reformation. So someone like me, who confessionally identifies with that, has to sort of take that seriously and own up to all the kind of complex heritage that comes out of that.
Yeah, I don't know how related this is, but I love the way David Foster Wallace talks about being in this world as sort of in Infinite Jest when he's talking about sort of addiction, and how his different characters are clinging on to these sort of slogans that don't really seem to make, like, to them it's just complete nonsense, and yet it seems to work. Absolutely. For whatever reason.
It's one of the most fascinating, enduring themes in Wallace is, I would say it's about the ritual power of cliche, right? Because even in I think Pale King, you get this sense that I can't believe we're just parroting these cliches, and yet it's the ritual of parroting the cliches that actually is sort of shaping you, informing you. I agree. I think it is relevant in some ways.
It's just not going back very far. It's going back to AA.
No, that's true. That's true.
And
although I have a friend who was a Catholic priest at Villanova who did a long study about all of AA's debts to Aristotelian virtue theory. So you could actually be, AA is living on borrowed capital. And there's been ongoing work now on addiction and virtue that I think is starting to explore that.
Alistair McIntyre goes rock and roll.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So another thing that I loved about this was when you addressed apologetics, which is, it's like a bad habit. It just continues. It goes on and on. That's the nicest metaphor I can come up with for it. And it says, Taylor says, if you're doing apologetics in a modern context, you've already conceded the argument, basically. You see this with like Ken Ham and Bill Nye. They've just gone around the circle again. Yeah. And so what do? Yeah. Do you just not do apologetics, or do you, is it better to try and train our young children in genealogies of modernity?
Yeah, right.
What do we do?
How many weekend seminars can we fill up with come learn the genealogy of modernity? Part of what could nuance the conversation is realizing that apologetics can mean a lot of different things, right? So the kind of apologetics that Taylor is quite critical of, and which I think is an illuminating conversation for us, is the sort of propositional rationalist apologetic that doesn't realize how much it has accepted the terms of what Taylor calls the immanent frame, right? So it's one of the reasons why so much of the God that is demonstrated by our apologetic strategies just turns out to be the God of deism, right? It doesn't have that kind of robust and Christological features. So in some ways, Taylor is a good Pascalian on this front, right? That said, I do think there is another kind of sort of apologetic strategy going on in Taylor, which is not a tit-for-tat argument in which I'm going to come up with a demonstrative proof so that I win. But his apologetic is a narratival one, right? I'm going to offer an alternative story that you can try on and see if it makes sense of your experience. That story, he's quite unabashed that at crucial points it's informed by his own Catholic and Christian convictions. But he says, look, we all start from some confessional place in a way. All theories are grounded in some faith commitments. So let me put this one on the table and see if it doesn't do a better job. And what's interesting are those points at which he's actually fairly confident that it does do a better job, right? So it's not just a tepid apologetic like I'm sorry. It's that would be a very Canadian apologetic. This is an apologetic where it's not out to win, but it is out to offer, and in the process is trying to make the Christian story plausible in a new way
by doing better justice to human fullness.
Yeah, right, and interestingly, what I think is so instructive in Taylor is how much he is kind of awed by the ability of what he calls exclusive humanism to craft this remarkably meaningful account of significance without appeal to transcendence or without appeal to eternity. He stands back and instead of like getting his hackles up saying, I've got to take that down, in some ways he stands back and he says, that, congratulations, that is a heck of an accomplishment. That's quite a different posture from which to start your apologetic conversation, right?
Definitely. So I guess to wrap things up a little bit, I'd like to know where does Charles Taylor and James Smith begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, all the really brilliant parts are Charles Taylor. It's interesting. In a lot of ways, Taylor and I have very similar formations too. So his philosophical formation also comes out of a mix of kind of the phenomenological tradition, the pragmatist tradition. So there's a lot of resonances. What's interesting is it's not until you get to the end of the book that you start to realize that Taylor is actually willing to sort of throw overboard aspects of the Christian tradition to make it more believable. That is, he thinks that there are things that are just so implausible, say a doctrine of eternal punishment or maybe features of a Christian sexual ethic. And for Taylor, keeping Christian faith as a live, plausible option, he thinks seems to require that we jettison some of these pieces. I'm not at all convinced of that, though I do think we have to own up to the difficulty and challenge of that. So in the last couple chapters of my book, I try to suggest, okay, well, here's an alternative direction that I think we could do, or a different path that we could take and try to make a case for that.
Awesome. Well, it's definitely worth reading, and I definitely enjoyed it an awful lot.
Great. It was really exciting to work on. I've been encouraged by the kinds of chatter that's happening around Taylor, even over the last few months. So I hope it'll be a helpful project.
And there are lots and lots of people who need to know how not to be secular and how to be secular.
Yeah, and that's the real goal, isn't it? I mean, this huge 900-page book by Taylor is not going to be read by many people, but there is such an existentially significant point that he's making that I hope this book can make that accessible to a wider audience.
It did to me. Great. Thanks for being here.
Excellent. My pleasure. Thank you.